بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. My dearest respected brothers and listeners in Islam, Hafiz Suhail Ughradar, who is sitting on my right hand side, he did his Madrasah studies at Quwwatul Islam. He completed his hifz at Quwwatul Islam. He taught Madrasah at Quwwatul Islam. Hafiz Suhail, he took part in the work of dawat and tabligh with the Jama'at of our masjid Quwwatul Islam, and he spent 40 days on multiple occasions. His social circle involved the likes of myself, Maulana Safwan and many others, and we have been on social outings on many occasions. Later on in life, Hafiz became a compulsive gambler. So the question is, what went wrong? But more importantly, how did it then all go right? Today's question time, my respected brothers in Islam, is to explore some home truths on an individual level as well as on a community level. It's designed to explore what preventative measures can we put in place for ourselves, our loved ones, so that a car crash does not happen. And for those individuals who are already engaged in such vices, what possible solutions can they implement in their lives to come back onto Hidayah and onto the right path? Now, my respected brothers in Islam, I know for a fact, first of all, I would wholeheartedly like to extend my appreciation to Hafiz for coming here today, and I am hopeful that inshallah this will be a means of beneficial, if not for someone in the Jamaat, kana someone who is listening. And it's not been easy. It's not been easy for Hafiz to come amongst us, and the weakness is not because of him, the weakness is because of individuals like myself. And when I'm talking about home truths, I really mean this. And we are going to explore this a little on later on, inshallah. So Hafiz, my first question to yourself, just to give a little bit of a background, is how would you describe your childhood leading to your teen years?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli wa nusallim ala rasulihil kareem. Up until at the age of, I started my hifz at a young age from year 6 onwards. So from year 6 until completion around GCSE time, it was spent in the pursuit of completing the completion of the Quran hifz. So I was quite committed in that journey. At that very young age, I also moved away from my parents' house to live with my grandma with the intention of being a person who's there and looking after her and just being another person present. So along that journey, I would say that I was engaging with friends outside. I would say I had a good social kind of company outside of the masjid, engaged in the Jamaat of the work of Jama'at tabligh at around the year 10 onwards, and relentlessly engaged in that work with the support of the Satis at Quwwatul Islam, alhamdulillah. Where and how was the upbringing there? I would say, alhamdulillah, I felt I was doing something positive. The hifz had support. However, I still felt isolated within myself, internally, in that journey. Even though I was going out in tabligh, there was a struggle present, you know. And especially around anyone who has experienced any sort of addiction or difficulty, mental health difficulty, then we are products of our environment. So the environment within the masjid is, alhamdulillah, very conducive However, outside in our homes, that environment might not be so. So we might be surrounded by particular aspects of our upbringing which could have negative impacts on our in going forward. So for example, if individuals at a young age are exposed to, let's say, any sort of trauma, so it could be domestic abuse, etc., along them lines, then that would leave a negative impression on that individual and hinder their ability going forward into emotionally, intellectually. So I was gripping that. So I was going out in the work of tabligh. Members of my family may have not been involved in that. So there was this struggle, internal battle, that why is this happening? Why the difficulty around home, and why is Allah not changing this kind of situation? So I used to make a lot of dua in that particular period. As time went on, friends started to pursue their own interests. Some got married, university, etc. And then that's when the issues started in terms of not finding other things to do which were healthy. So around in my mid-20s, I started to engage in that gambling behavior. And it was very intermittent. There was a lot of shame bounded around that. So I would say the upbringing on the face of it to somebody is fantastic. Mashallah, look at him. But inwardly, you say when you grow up, that support network, it was lacking. Not as a criticism to anybody else, but that's just the way things kind of turned out.
Okay. So, Hafiz, before we go into some specifics, as a mock of definition, can you explain what is addiction?
Addiction is a desire to do something compulsively, despite negative consequences around a person. Generally speaking, that behavior is negative, and so it could be any type of behavioral addiction or substance. So if it's, for example, food, a person has an unhealthy relationship with food, that they continue doing that despite it affecting them. It could be avoiding food. So addiction is something that even if the person doesn't want to do it, they are compelled to do it, because we know that it affects the brain and brain chemicals.
Okay, so we've understood that you grew up in a Muslim household, in a Muslim community. You were surrounded by good people. You became a Hafiz, so you had that connection with the Quran. You were performing your salah. All the things that we constantly tell our youngsters to do. So what was missing in your life that you think took you down this road?
I think it's the opportunity to discuss. So as a young person growing up in this society, as I said, we are products of our environment, so we are consuming more. If a person attending school, college, university, they're consuming a lot of negative. So usually, generally speaking, if the household is a supportive environment and has a kind of open and transparent relationship between the siblings, between parents and children, then they are able to pose these questions to their parents. They're able to discuss any pertinent issues which are affecting them mentally, emotionally, physically. Unfortunately, that was the missing factor where I wasn't able. So, for example, it would be very normal for a mother or a father to the child to kind of speak endearingly towards your child, because you love them naturally. Growing up, that still should be the case. So how we interact with our children and create that sense of love, attachment, that could play a big difference. So if you're not getting your love at home, if you're not getting that attachment at home, people are going to seek it elsewhere. And that's why we see every person who goes through anything similar, or they're exposed to domestic abuse, trauma, violence, something like that, they generally repeat that behavior when they grow up if they haven't had that support. So I felt it was the ability not to speak openly to somebody about any of the issues. So for example, it could be Tabligh Jamaat. I was with my colleague Satis, not being able to speak about the difficulties that a person is experiencing at home, what happens that manifests in negative ways. So in order to manage it, in order to cope with it, sometimes intentionally, unintentionally. So if you turn to drugs, alcohol, gambling, any sort of behavior, it releases dopamine chemicals in your brain, feel good chemicals. You want to repeat that again. What that does is isolate you from everyday life, and it becomes all consuming because you want to create it. So nobody becomes a druggie, nobody becomes an alcoholic or a gambler intentionally, and it could be a financial issue, but nevertheless within that person, what it does, it's a feel good factor. It makes them feel good for that temporary moment of time. He forgets or she forgets where they are, any difficulties that they're experiencing. So in absence of that, people engage in that behavior, the absence of love, attachment.
Okay, so I think what we've understood is a listening ear, okay, from a family environment, but as well as for example, imams, as scholars, as elders of the community, we're all suspects of this in some shape or form. But does an individual character take a big part of this as well? So if someone's shy or has low self-esteem, does that person become more vulnerable?
Yeah, they are. So one of the key risk factors of a person engaging in any sort of risky, negative or even mental health is low self-esteem and boredom. So if a person has a naturally reticent, reclusive, and people call themselves antisocial or anything like that, then they are more prone to issues, because what they will do is internalize things. They're not able to talk to somebody about it, process. Sometimes an issue could be very small, but in their mind it's catastrophized and it's very big, and people then start self-medicating, meaning turning to things which are kind of unhealthy. So it's the biggest challenge is to speak to and support people who are naturally very shy and naturally very reserved. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that they are kind of beyond any help. Of course they are, because within the household, within the community, there will be somebody who they will have attachment with. There will be one person at least who they are able to speak and confide in, generally speaking.
So inshallah we will explore later on in terms of possible solutions, because this is like a household. Okay, you're our local resident, local imams, local scholars, and we want to take away some practical action points that we can try and implement, not just for our own households, but for our entire community and youngsters. Inshallah, we will explore that later on. When we talk about addiction, would you say that drugs, pornography, gambling, they are all the same or thereabouts?
According to, so if you understand and study how the brain works when a person consumes any kind of substance or engages in gambling behavior, then it's very much the same. So for example, some doctors, they did studies upon a person engaging in gambling behavior. So they put that person underneath a scanner, MRI scanner, and studied the brain. So the brain, it activated, was stimulated before a person placed a bet. For example, the brain was stimulated similar levels to after they found out whether they won or lost. So it's about the stimulation. A person drinks alcohol, there's a famous saying that people say, drowning their sorrows. It's a comforting feeling for an individual. So what it does, relatively these addictions are the same. Self-harm, very much the same. A person, you think, why would you kind of cut yourself in that way? It's because when they do that action, it releases dopamine in the brain. It's a feel-good chemical. And every time they do it, the levels of dopamine are depleting, so they're trying to seek it more. So the behavior becomes more intense, more erratic.
Okay. When you're talking to some youngsters and even adults, they say that I only want to try it once, or I've only watched it once. And then that once becomes twice. In your case, when did you realize that once or twice has now become addiction?
Good question. So I'll just answer something that came to mind. So people generally, a lot of people try these particular substances or that behavior socially. So what will happen is couple of individuals will go to a casino, for example, everyone will be there, it's just something that they're doing. Always what happens within that cohort, within that group, there'll be one individual who will become compulsive with that. So what people are studying, that why is that the case? So it could be a biological makeup. So people who are studying genetics, for example, will know about epigenetics, that people have genetic markers where they may be more prone to that kind of behavior. Okay, so it can be intergenerational as well. Not saying that there's a addiction gene in that individual, but there are markers. Okay, so some individuals may be more prone to that behavior. And when does it become a problem? When you start, obviously addiction, the foundation of it is that it's a breakdown of character. So what it does slowly, it erodes a person's character. So when you start doing things which are against your values, that's when you know that you're addicted. So when you're lying about where you are, or lying about what you're engaged in, being secretive about it, that's when you know that it's become problematic.
Okay, so, and I guess that's why our deen is so pure that it teaches us. So for example, when it comes to zina, and when we're talking about zina, we're talking about pornography and everything, the deen teaches us that wala taqrabu zina, do not even go near it. So how can those boundaries be implemented?
So I think education, preventative education, is quite important. You know, I spoke to an alim once and talked about the work which we were doing about raising awareness about gambling. That's my particular area of work. So he said, well, there's a feeling out there, or there's a belief that if we don't tell them, they don't know. So if I started doing a PowerPoint presentation here about the types of gambling involved in gaming, for example, someone might say, well, if you didn't tell the children or young people this, they wouldn't know. But this is a flawed way of thinking, because outside somebody else will tell them. If you go to the town centre, you will see the amount of betting shops. You know, the gambling organisation spent 1.5 billion pounds every year on advertising alone, and if we look at what we're doing, so it's very minimum in comparison to that. So I think education is quite important, having open discussions, you know, about these, because we are exposed to it. If young people are exposed to it on their phone, even though the legislation, for example, Instagram, you've got to be this age to make an account, we know people circumvent this, you know, and still create an account. So despite that, we need to equip young people and ourselves about what it is, what it does to an individual.
So I don't want to try and keep the focus too much on gambling, but just to understand a little bit more, is the driving force wealth? You know, sometimes people think that they're only gambling because they want to acquire more wealth. Is that the only case?
Not at all. So like I discussed before, the motivations to engage in that behavior are underlying. You know, so there's a famous saying about somebody said, why don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. So there's always something that they are masking. It could be boredom. So within South Asian or BAME communities, if we look at where we live, you know, there could be, if for example, the non-Muslim, they have a lot of things that they do in terms of entertainment. For us, for young people especially, there could be a lack of green spaces, a lack of things to do in terms of leisure. That could be, okay, we can't engage in that, so let's do something else. Okay, so it could be that particular, that not enough things to do for individuals and young people, so that could be that, okay, they turn to these particular things which can be kind of consuming.
Okay, be very frank, the thought that's coming to mind, because especially when it comes to Muslim children and so forth, we have a very, very intense day. We have schooling, straight after school we have Madrasah, which pretty much excludes extracurricular activities. Not to say that this takes a part, but do you think that there is an element of, you know, a thought process that needs to be developed in this area?
So for example, mental health issues and addiction, etc., are quite prevalent with people in white collar kind of jobs, so high intense kind of jobs. So a lot of people want to let steam off or kind of wind down, and their wind down could be that they engage in this. So having a very intense. So we talk about in our deen to have to be moderate, to live the middle way. So I think the middle way in that, incorporating exercise for young people, incorporating activities which are outside of the normal madrasa school kind of routine, I think it's quite important.
Okay, I read an article just over the weekend where a woman who won £127,000, she says that that's the worst day of her life. Can you relate to this and explain why?
Absolutely. So one of the risk factors of people kind of displaying problematic kind of gambling is a big win that they've experienced. So when we were very young, fairgrounds, used to have those 2p, 10p machines. We will look at it innocently, but that's by definition, that's gambling. So a lot of people who we speak to, our clients, they say that my journey started when I won. And a lot of people who have big wins initially try to recreate that. So yes, definitely someone who's won initially, that potentially they will go back. Another person might say to them, well, aren't you content? This is what you wanted anyway. However, always look at it in terms of how it affects the brain. A person who's addicted to something is not in control. That's why as a parents or people in the family or friends, how we respond to an individual is quite important, because that individual, do they have autonomy? Because if their brain is telling them to do something, I'm not saying there's no personal responsibility here, but that it's very strong. The impulses are very strong and it rewires the brain. An individual did 2 scans on the brain, the normal brain and the addicted brain. The addicted brain shrunk even the prefrontal cortex that we use to make sensible decisions, that shrinks. Okay, and when a person is in the throes of addiction, their judgment is very much clouded as well.
So from a parent's perspective, let me give you 2 live examples which I'm sure many parents will be able to relate to this. One of my younger sons, he's in year 4 now, okay, and he absolutely enjoys buying football cards because that's the season at the moment. And I can relate to a lot of what you're saying, that it's opening that packet, that excitement to see that which players are there. And then you alluded to gaming as well, buying certain animations. From a parent's perspective, a quick fix is that, £1 here, take your packet and that's it. But what sort of damage is causing on the other end, and what advice would you give to parents on this?
So there's a big kind of emerging issue around FIFA packs. So a lot of you may know FIFA packs, loot boxes. Fortnite has loot boxes, FIFA packs, you buy them. So Netherlands and Belgium have banned loot boxes because they categorize it as gambling.
Can you just explain what loot boxes is?
So loot boxes are kind of mystery boxes that you get in games. Okay, generally Fortnite is a free game, you don't have to pay for it, but what the game designers do is monetize the game. So in order to advance in the game, they may encourage you to buy these boxes, or sometimes you get them free anyway within the game. Similar with FIFA. FIFA, generally speaking, they don't want you to grind through the game, they want you to excel, and one particular avenue is buying the FIFA packs. Generally, Ronaldo, Messi, the odds of getting them would be very, very high, probably 1,000,000 to 1 or something like that. Okay, so what happens is, as a young person whose brain is still developing, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, still developing, think about the brain chemistry, about how addiction works and the dopamine release, impulsive behavior. Then a young person who's opening these boxes, what would happen is that they will be unable to control themselves. So okay, they make it very stimulating, okay, they make it very colorful and exciting. That's the whole idea, is to get them hooked on. So basically and what tends to happen afterwards is, if they haven't got a Messi or a player that is good like Mbappe or somebody, then they will want another one. They'll want another one, okay? And then they will lose the consciousness that how much I'm spending anyway, how much I'm spending. And that's almost training your brain to become compulsive around something. And similarly, it works with Candy Crush and all these particular games. I've supported people who, for example, from Candy Crush have developed a gambling addiction, and a female, and from Muslim community. Because innocent games, what they do, for example, if you put 8-ball pool, then 8-ball pool is a free game you can download, okay? Then it has spins within the game as well. But generally, if you have more points, then you'll get free spins. Those free spins run out, they'll encourage you to buy them. By definition, that is gambling. But what is it doing to your brain? Okay, you're becoming attached. Sometimes when you're scrolling, you'll feel it yourself that, okay, I'm probably on this too long. As a young person, when do they say, no, this is too much? Probably not. Okay, until the card says declined. I've done presentations with people, and even police officers, for example, have said their children even, it's become so problematic that they've ended up getting a big bill at home because children have spent hundreds and thousands of pounds on Fortnite games, and they are just, in Fortnite itself, is just a cosmetic feature. For example, the skins, they don't even improve the game. However, one skin could be worth a lot of money, and this is where it becomes fully fledged gambling, where people are betting on skins. Skins betting is a new thing. I met one person, Muslim lad in Blackburn, and 17 years old, you know, had a very promising career, went to private school, was going to go on to study sixth form at a grammar school, and he got involved in gaming, became a semi-professional gamer, okay, was very interested in it. His parents were very much against this, okay. His dad was a doctor, very much against this. However, he couldn't get himself off it, you know, locked himself in the room, problems at home, relationship breakdown between the son and the father, and he still used to secretly go for games. He told me once that one skin he had sold for £3,000, and this is just a cosmetic feature within the game. So I think as parents we need to be more clued up upon what types of games our children are involved in, and especially around these loot boxes, because in the UK itself, within the COVID lockdown period, £200 million were made by EA Sports upon loot boxes itself, just in the UK. Globally, it's £1 billion economy. That's why the government will probably not deem it as gambling just yet, because it's a big kind of tax revenue.
Okay, Jazakallah for that. Hafiz, one thing that many individuals will struggle to understand is, on one side, someone's addicted to drugs, pornography, gambling, whatever addiction there is. But statistics show that almost 70% or more gamblers, for example, they feel suicidal. So how can we marry the two together, that on one side they want to carry on with something, but at the same time the level of anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts is also increasing?
Yeah. So before I answer that question, I'll tell you, within South Asian community, there's studies that show that if a person from the South Asian community gambles, and I guess you could take this with any other addiction, then they are 5 to 6 times more likely to experience harm than a person from the white ethnicity. So 5 times more likely, if they engage in that behavior, they're going to experience some kind of harm anyway. And in terms of marrying the two, that a person who's engaging that behavior is relentless in it and is still feeling suicidal, it's because that's the only thing that they know. So if, for example, they've lost thousands of pounds of money, then how in their mind they believe that this, if gambling got me into this mess, it's going to get me out of it. So what tends to happen is a flawed fallacy, a flawed way of thinking. So when I told you about the cognitive brain, that's why you need psychotherapy and therapy, because a person's judgment becomes very construed and becomes it's not rational, okay? So they will gamble more and more, and eventually they will engage in criminality. And there are only 3 places a person will go. Either a person will end up in jail, a person will either take their own life, or a person will become homeless, and this is inevitable. Studies have shown this, okay? So it's because of the strong impulses a person experiences, and also that they believe that if this particular, I'm only one win away from actually sorting everything out, okay? So it's quite a very, from all the addictions, I would say, in terms of drugs, how much a person can consume drugs? How much can they consume before physically they can't take anymore? Alcohol, how much a person can consume before they kind of just go flat out, okay? They're not conscious. With gambling, there is no end. There is no end. A person, as long as they have the capital, they'll continue gambling. And they'll do whatever it takes. So in their mind, they are borrowing. So whatever criminality they're doing, in their mind, they are borrowing because I will put this back or I will organize this. I'm only one win kind of away. And when they engage in that behavior, they forget about the kind of debts or the issues that are occurring in their own life. And that's because what tends to happen as a byproduct of that is a person feels suicidal. A person feels that, okay, I can't talk to anybody, so what can I do? This is the only kind of way out. And I've met individuals who've been on the brink or actually have kind of reached that stage because they have been unable to speak to anyone. It's too big to speak to anyone. That's the kind of feeling that the mess is too much. Example, like myself, if a person thinking, okay, I have this reputation, I am spiritually, okay, I am here, how is a person going to marry this? If I speak to somebody, how is a person, first his eyes will pop out and think, what have you got yourself into? So it's a very difficult situation for any addiction person is to speak to somebody because they fear the judgment. It's better for an individual subconsciously to stay in denial than be open about it, because denial itself is a coping mechanism. As long as I'm in denial, I don't have to admit to everything that's happened. Until I say I have an issue, then you've got to take responsibility. So that's why people prefer to say, I don't have an issue.
And I guess, is that when people start leading a double life?
Yes, absolutely. Jekyll and Hyde, okay? And it's sincere. For many people, it is sincere. So they want to be charitable. They want to present themselves as being spiritual even, or good people. These are, generally speaking, that the clients and people that we see, I believe myself as a good person, but struggling with something, a big struggle. So a lot of people do lead that double life, and that cognitive dissonance. So what it does internally, so if you look at the soul, the ruh itself, it's dragging itself towards Allah, Tawheed, towards purity, and then the other side is dragging it towards evil, okay, and that conflict, you can see it visibly in terms of stress, mental illness, etc., because they are not in harmony in that sense.
So, sometimes you come across individuals and they're always smiling, laughing, bubbly, and once they start pouring their heart out, you think, yeah, Rob, this guy is living hell on earth, literally. Whether it's marriage issues or drugs or whatever it is, what's the best and the worst thing this person can do?
I think the best thing that person can do is speak to somebody, whether that is away from the community, away from the space, but looking for a safe space where they are not going to be judged. Because the reason why 3 qualities a person needs to have our community is compassion, to be non-judgmental, and to be empathetic. This is what a person living with an addiction looks for in an individual. That if I speak to somebody, I don't want them to judge me based on my actions. I also want them to feel sorry for me, even though, they might not be, but that's what they're looking for. And I want them to understand what I'm living through right now. And a lot of times when people do access support, that's what they say. It must be very difficult for you right now, because it is for individuals. So that's why they prefer to be in denial. So they might be happy, presenting to be happy. They might be going on holidays even with their family. You couldn't have an inkling. There have been many cases where partners of people who have engaged in that behavior have been oblivious to what's happening, okay, because that individual has been living double lives. And people like this, for example, are very good liars, or very good at concealing that life, experts at concealing that life. So it's actually hard for family members they shouldn't really blame themselves, because it is hard, because they do go out of their way to conceal that kind of behavior. But for the individual that is suffering, I think whether they are ready or not ready to accept that help and support, I think speaking to someone is quite important, whether that's at work, whether that's at outside of the community, to a Muslim, non-Muslim. I think it's very important, because the trend is that people go for support when things are a crisis point. A person his mental health has declined, they're either going to be sectioned, they're going to be homeless, or they're going to go to prison or something like that. That's when people tend to, the penny drops, or they hit their rock bottom. The concern about waiting for a person's rock bottom is that is a person's rock bottom when they take their own life. I think early intervention is quite important, and I guess I can talk about some of the ways people can help, or individuals.
Okay. In a hadith it comes, al-mar'u ala dini khalilihi, that a person will be on the religion of his friends. Looking back at your physical friends, it all seems that, alhamdulillah, it was a good social circle, and we've discussed this. In the 21st century, do you think the definition of friendship has now changed? So many times we see that individuals who are going down a slippery slope, you try and identify, and we've had these discussions in the month of Ramadan where we've been emphasizing on friendship, but it starts to feel that friendship is no longer in the form of physical people. We've moved drastically away from this now.
Yeah. So if you look at in terms of social media or internet use itself, then we know that the developers, social media apps, etc., want you to live on the app, basically. They want you to remain there, update them about every single thing that they do. And in terms of every time you're scrolling through it, it's giving you a hit of dopamine. So as an individual, you're feeling good being there. Okay, it's making you feel good remaining on that particular app or whatever is that the individual is doing. So what tends to happen is that they'd rather live in that virtual space than live in the real world. In the real world, you've got to meet your relatives. In the real world, you've got to meet your parents or your friends on a good day and a bad day. Online, that's not the case, because you can build your own reality online. And with the emergence of like the metaverse and things like that, it's even more concerning that our young people and even adults will be more tethered to the online world rather than the earthly real world. Okay, and that's when social anxiety. So you might find out from your own children that he's not he doesn't really meet the relative, he doesn't interact with the family, and social skills are a bit obscure, and that's because of the reliance upon living in an online world where you're not really taught to behave in that traditional kind of way. Although there are benefits of using social media and using things like that, but as a young person, then there are no boundaries there. A person in their 40s, 50s may be able to distinguish what is good for me, how much consumption is good for me. However, a young person may not know that. And online itself, they'll build up a particular reality, or kind of the reality that they want other people to perceive, in that virtual world. So at school or every day, they might be known as a loner or shy person, not really intelligent. Online, they could be somebody else. And especially online, if they're trolled, for example, and things like that, that could have a very adverse impact upon their own mental health as well. And we have seen through Instagram and things like that, young people taking their own life or engaging in self-harming type behaviors. And even in terms of sexuality and things like that, difficulties coming in because they build themselves a different reality and a version. Apostasy itself is a big concern amongst Muslim young people, and that comes from what they're consuming online. Okay, so if their friends here don't really do it for them, online it's a different. You can create your own space, create your own community, and that's the difficulty.
So a person who's spending too much time in the bedroom, and there are many parents who have raised concerns on this, should that individual for himself be concerned, and should family members and loved ones be concerned for them as well?
I think loved ones should be concerned, definitely. Somebody might say, I'm studying in my bedroom, but how could you validate and verify that? So I think even in itself, a person isolating themselves is never going to have a positive impact upon a person's well-being. And what tends to happen is family members initially might react in a mocking way, and use certain terms which may further isolate that individual. And what tends to happen is, what arises is that breakdown within the family. And what I always say to families or individuals is, maintain the relationship with that person. You always have to never, even if that person is throes of addiction, or whether they're finding difficulty with the online thing, I think it's always important to maintain open lines of communication and not kind of eviscerate that person for what they're doing, etc. I think engaging in dialogue, and if we don't feel best fit to do that, then I think we should learn and how to engage in. I think compassion is quite important, because what tends to happen is people have run away with their own thoughts when they're isolated. What is a small issue is, like I mentioned before, they catastrophize it and it becomes something very big. And what we must remember as, I guess, parents and individuals is that we've got to be there for young people in every stage. The biggest issue was that I think the pressure is quite immense. If you're a Hafiz, for example, it comes with a certain pressure. If an alim, I guess there's a certain pressure there. When is a person allowed to be, I'm talking about the family structure here, allowed to be an individual, So I think if a person is like that, I think supporting them through all the trials, I think I'll be there for you no matter what. And I think building up that relationship with your children, I think is very important, because out there people are waiting with their arms out saying, come here. So I think maintaining that rapport, building that rapport with our children, where they're able to come to us for anything. And I think that takes time. Some people might be on the other end where it's broken down. So I think taking small steps to build that by doing things together. It doesn't have to be anything to do with your deen, or it could be going for a walk together, going something which there's a common interest in, and slowly what will happen is that person will feel better in your company. The COVID lockdown, there was, in that time, the domestic abuse issues within the household rocketed in lockdown itself, because people weren't used to living with each other. They weren't used to living with each other. They weren't used to being in the same room as each other. So I think we've got to learn to build that rapport, if that rapport does not exist, that is.
Do you think that family members in some cases would be the biggest victims in all this? So if there's an individual in the household with addiction, family becomes victim. And I know you're saying that that rapport needs to be there, but that balancing act between the family dynamics, it pushes the test limits to the highest. What would your advice be on that?
So when I say, I think having compassion.
And if I can just add so that you can think it, sometimes family members or even counselors or individuals, they think it's just easier to eliminate this problem and then we all carry on with our life and then see if that full circle happens later on in life.
So in the sense of families, so families are affected as well, massively. So families could experience depression, anxiety, their whole world has been turned upside down, because they had this particular ideal of my son, daughter will be like this, they'll have dreams. So you can imagine what the trauma that they may be going through. And I don't say it's easy, it's never easy. And when I say you have to deal with it with compassion, I think there's no other way, because it's proven that if you react, if you kick them out, or I'm not saying keep them in the house, for example, if they're going through a very severe addiction, I think what's important is to let them know that I am there, but instill boundaries. You've got to have boundaries within the household, that you can't ask for money, for example, or you can't, what we're going to decide is not for you not to be in your room on your own, but having certain boundaries and consulting with professionals about what the boundaries are, I think will help. But what we must remember is that maybe for that person, they have to learn how to live differently, and we may have to learn to accept that this has happened. I think acceptance is quite important, that this has happened, and now we need to learn how to accept it and move on from it, because a lot of times I think the judgment, and sometimes the fear is they're going to mention it again, and in conversations it's mentioned, and the person just becomes isolated and doesn't interact with yourself, So I think once you've realized that person needs support, and you also get support so you might not want to go to therapy or something like that, but bring somebody into the house who knows what they're talking about, and taking it from there, I think can be quite helpful, because when advice and guidance is misdirected, that it can cause more harm, So a lot of people have been advised that, no, keep them at home. But if, for example, there are siblings in the house who are, for example, if that other instance, for example, a young person, 17 years old, having aggressive outbursts in the household, and there are 5 and 4-year-old children in the house, that's not healthy at all. So you've got to consult that what are we going to do in terms of get some advice and then take it from there.
Okay, you said the word. When you said sons, you said daughters as well. Would it be a typical stereotype to think that girls aren't involved in any form of addiction?
I think you're kidding yourself if you believe that, definitely, because in fact some of the issues might be heightened, like for example self-harm is quite common amongst girls. Within gambling itself, or even drugs, alcohol, we would be surprised. What I say is you have to keep an open mind, when nurturing and raising children. I think being aware and not kind of having blinkers as to what's happening around. And the problem with women or females is that the shame and stigma for them is even more. So to find out and to support them is even bigger challenge, because they experience more shame and more kind of stigma around what's happening.
Okay. So when we're talking about addiction, it becomes like a daily thing, or is it something which is even more common than a day, multiple times a day? How engrossed does a person become?
So slowly, what turns out to be something could be seasonal, something could be a weekly thing. It then kind of develops into a daily obsession, so they call it we hear of obsessive compulsive disorders. In the same way, any kind of addiction, it could consume a person's life, preoccupation. So there are absenteeism, where they're present at work, but they're not actually there, because what they're thinking about is engaging in that behavior. How am I going to do this? Planning things. So for a person, it could be all consuming. But when that person decides that they want help and support, whatever, then slowly those neural pathways, they make new ones. The brain heals. We believe in healing, and slowly what tends to happen, the cravings, etc., kind of diffuse, and it becomes easy. So I've met individuals who've been off heroin and things like that for 20 odd years. They've never gone back to it. So, and even gambling, 44 years, 19 years, 6 years, 7. It depends. So definitely don't want to paint a kind of a doom and gloom kind of story here. It is possible, but I think we do need to consult the professionals, and we've got to consult them in how to move forward and support the individual. And for the individual themselves, I think just speak about it, being open and reaching out without any commitment. You know, you don't have to commit yourself to any recovery or any program, or you don't have to tell anybody, but just seek that support.
And I guess, listeners, the therapy, so all this we can relate back to our seerah. So when we're talking about going and speaking to someone, just think about it. The Sahaba Kiram, the best and the best of all people, they went to the best of all creations, Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and it comes in a hadith where the Sahabi was seeking permission to commit zina from Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. When you just pause and think about it, it's something which is unbelievable. But the reason why that happened is so that me and you today, we can take some lessons. And whilst, when I extended this invitation to Hafiz Sahab, Sahaba Kiram, there were those who committed zina. There were those who did gambling. There were those who took substances which they shouldn't have. And they went through a process of rehabilitation. So me and you today in our society, if we think that we are going to be free from all this, then we are literally living in Kukulan. Hafiz Sahab went through these motions. And if that wasn't the case, so many sciences, I'm telling you myself that I have referred individuals to Hafiz Sahab because I do not have the required skills. And if he did not go through these motions, maybe he wouldn't have studied. So there is, when we say that there is a blessing in disguise, our deen teaches us that, being open, pragmatic about it, going to individuals, seeking help is definitely amongst the first steps of rehabilitation. However, many parents would feel that having an upbringing in an Islamic nursery, Islamic primary school, Islamic secondary school, and now we've got Islamic sixth form as well, thinking that their responsibility has now been discharged because they've been secured in a bubble in such a way that we don't really need to have intervention. What's your thoughts on this?
I think it is good and to have that community and to have those environments where we are able to send our children. But we know that a person, for example, if we look at a boarding school or Darul Ulum type environment, a person living a sheltered type environment, and we almost cocoon them in a particular kind of way, and we fashion them, okay, they're going to turn out like this. Young people want to fit in. They have this sense of between those young ages, in the teenage years, they are forming an identity. So through that, when they, for example, on the weekends or online or whatever, they will be struggling, and they may get involved with good friends, bad friends, etc. I think so. So understanding that we haven't discharged our duty in terms of parents by just sending them to these institutions, because by these institutions are by and large about educating, and although nurturing and that may be part of their values, that's in the home. And I think the bond between the son, the daughter, and the father and mother, I think the benefits of that and the impact of that is lifelong. In terms of, that person, they grow up, they get married, etc. That they learn that from the parents, those life lessons, So I think if we believe, and we know cases that a person might go to a particular institute but might turn out in a certain way, and we may criticize the institution, or we may criticize the parents for that, okay? However, I think it's important to recognize that we haven't discharged our duty, but we need to maintain that kind of relation, because the environment out there is inviting them to 101 different things, okay? And the school and the madrasa may not be meeting those particular challenges out there, okay? So I think as parents, it's our duty, how we are forming these particular discussions and how we are encouraging those kind of habits, because we will see that through a young person's kind of lifetime, they will go in and out of different companies. So periodically they might involved in bad company. How will you deal with that particular situation? They might then find good company again. So I think it's about that guidance has to be from the parents,
Okay, and I think finally, because we're almost coming towards iftar time, what would the 39-year-old Hafiz Suhail, who's in front of me now, say to the 15-year-old Hafiz Suhail?
I think that's quite a deep question. I think it's very easy for me. What would I say? I think communication. There are many things that could have been resolved very easily just by a conversation by a person, and not kind of judging somebody. So I was judging people. I'm talking about being non-judgmental. I was possibly judging people. Well, he'll think of me in this way, in this fashion. So I think I would have spoke to somebody within my Jamaat, for example, whatever issues I was experiencing. So I think I would say just be brave and just talk, find a safe person to talk about it.
Jazakallahu khairan. Respected brothers in Islam, last few days of the month of Ramadan, we all have our struggles. Every person has their struggles, because if that wasn't the case, then we would not be on the face of this earth. Everyone in their own respective ways, they have their struggles. And the beautiful hadith of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam is at-ta'ibu min adh-dhanbi kaman la dhanba lah, that you raise your hands towards Allah, seek forgiveness, show that remorse. It is as though you have not committed that sin in the first place. You've not committed that sin in the first place. So much so that our deen during these last few nights of the month of Ramadan is saying that you are like a newborn baby. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has kept these doors open for us. And alhamdulillah, amongst the steps of rehabilitation now in our communities, we've got so many individuals, not just ulama, from our imams to Maulana Ahmad, to Maulana Ibrahim, to Maulana Muhammad, to the likes of Maulana Safwan, and the list is endless, from our Jamaat brothers, including for our sisters. It's not like how it used to be many, many, many years ago. And if we are still vulnerable, then can you imagine the societies that are beyond, who don't have these resources, how difficult it will be for them. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all the correct understanding. There is a lot to take over. There is something that individuals on all different levels need to have a development plan from this, from the scholars to the parents to the youngsters and individuals. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala safeguard our entire community. I'm going to request Hafiz Sahib, inshallah, to make a short dua and conclude.
Forward, what we want to do. Like our society is so inclusive. They know the problem in the family, that they talk to anybody.
Okay.
How you do?
Yes, so Yakumama very clearly outlines that yes, we've heard what the problems are, possible solutions. And I'm just going to summarize amongst the solutions which Hafiz Sahib has given. Is number one is about communication, and he's emphasized this from the beginning, middle to the end. Communication with either your parents, communication with elders in the community. In fact, he did not even restrict it to just Muslims, including non-Muslims as well. So that is on an individual level. On a community and an organizational level, the resources needs to be there, happy places where individuals can come, address their problems, so that inshallah some form of therapy can take place. But inshallah there will be a lot more discussion on this, a lot more thought on this as well, so that we as a community can inshallah progress collectively. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all the correct understanding. But communication and remorse, Hafiz will inshallah make dua, and then we'll get ready for iftar inshallah.
الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم يا رب صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير خلق كلهم جزا الله عنا محمدا صلى الله عليه وسلم بما هو أهله. اللهم لك الحمد كما ينبغي لجلالك وجهك ولعظيم سلطانك. سبحانك سبحانك ما عظمك، سبحانك ما أرحمك، سبحانك لا نحصي ثناء عليك أنت كما أثنيت على نفسك. يا غفور رحيم، يا أول الأولين ويا آخر الآخرين. O most merciful Allah, most beloved Allah, forgive our sins. O Allah, forgive our major minor sins, Ya Allah. O Allah, protect our youth, Ya Allah. O Allah, grant us the sweetness of Iman, Ya Ilahul Alameen. O Allah, protect us from all the evils and the harms and the temptations, Ya Allah. O Allah, allow us to nurture our children, our generation, according to your wishes and according to the Sunnah of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Allow us to adorn our lives with the Sunnah of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Ya Allah, grant us taqwa, Ya Allah. Grant us piety. Grant us your fear in everything that we do, Ya Allah. Guide us, Ya Allah. Guide us until our last breath, Ya Allah. Allow our death to be upon La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. Ya Allah, grant shifa to all those individuals who are suffering from any kind of physical, mental or emotional ailments, Ya Allah. Ya Allah, You are Shafi, Ya Allah, You grant them shifa. O Allah, relieve their difficulties, Ya Allah. Relieve their hardships, Ya Allah. Grant afiyah to everyone, Ya Allah. Grant ease to everyone, Ya Allah. Those who, Allah, who are seeking Your support and seeking Your help, Ya Allah, You send aid to them, You support them, O Allah, through means which they cannot comprehend, Ya Allah. Ya Allah, grant us halal rozi, Ya Allah. Grant barakah in the our rozi, Ya Allah. O Allah, grant us rozi from means which we can't comprehend and make it sufficient, make it content for us, Ya Ilahul Alameen. Allow us, Ya Allah, to build a community where, Ya Allah, we can, Ya Allah, inculcate the ways of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Ya Allah, protect our madrasah, protect our leaders, Ya Allah, protect our ulama, and protect our young and protect our old, Ya Allah. اللهم صل على سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.